What if the place you thought was safe was hiding a secret strong enough to drown a whole town? On a stormy night, veteran Michael Turner and his loyal dog, Duke, stepped into an old cabin beneath a forgotten dam. To him, it was just a roof over his head. But Duke's restless barking in the dark raised a question no neighbor dared to answer. What happens if the dam gives way? What Michael uncovered would test his faith, his courage, and the strength of a bond only a soldier and his dog could share. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you love stories of loyalty and redemption, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The late autumn air was damp and heavy, and a low fog hung along the banks of the wide Kentucky River. A chill wind pressed against the skeletal trees that lined the dirt road, carrying with it the faint smell of rain-soaked pine and decaying leaves. The sky was gray, not with the sharpness of a coming storm, but with the exhausted sag of a season nearing its end. It was here, in this lonely pocket of Appalachia, that Michael Turner guided his old pickup down the winding road toward what would soon be his new home. Or, so the lawyer had called it in the letter. Michael was 48 years old, though the furrows across his brow and the gray threading his short-cropped hair suggested a man closer to 60. His shoulders were broad, still strong from years of manual labor, but there was a stiffness in his gait when he climbed out of the truck that betrayed the damage of old injuries. His eyes, a faded steel blue, seemed to drift off into the horizon, as though searching for threats that no longer existed. He had once been Sergeant Turner of the United States Army, a soldier who had led men through the burning deserts of Iraq. Now he was just Michael, a man without steady work, without family close by, with nothing but a tired body and the dog who had followed him through more darkness than most could endure. That dog was Duke, a German shepherd already in his 6th year of life. His coat was sable, dark across the back and shoulders, but fading to lighter tan near his legs and muzzle. His ears stood upright with the constant alertness of a soldier still on patrol, and his amber eyes missed little. Duke had been trained as a military K-9, though he had never left American soil. Instead, he had guarded bases and sniffed for explosives stateside, becoming Michael's companion when the Army no longer had use for him. Loyal, intelligent, and with a stubborn streak, Duke was more than a pet. He was a fellow veteran, bound to Michael by invisible scars. The cabin came into view at the end of the dirt road. It was smaller than Michael expected, a weather-beaten structure crouched beneath the looming shape of the old dam. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss and years, and one shutter clung desperately to its hinge like a soldier refusing to abandon his post. A rusted wind vane turned lazily above the roofline, squealing with every shift of the breeze. To most, it looked abandoned, a place better suited for ghosts than the living. Michael killed the engine, and the sudden silence pressed against his ears. He sat in the truck for a long moment, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other absently stroking Duke's head. His chest tightened as he thought about the absurdity of it all. 48 years old, sleeping in borrowed apartments, moving again like a man without roots, now arriving at a cabin gifted by a friend who had little else to give. That friend had been Tom Miller, a fellow veteran Michael had served with years ago. Tom had died the previous spring after a long fight with cancer, leaving the cabin to Michael in his will. Tom had described it in letters as a place to breathe, though Michael wondered now if what Tom meant was a place to be forgotten. "Come on, boy," Michael muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. Duke's tail gave a single thump against the seat before he leapt down onto the gravel. The dog sniffed the air, ears pricked, body tense as though the cabin itself were something alive that needed to be sized up. Michael unlocked the door with a key that had arrived in the lawyer's envelope. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, releasing the stale smell of wood smoke, mildew, and dust. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. A small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed covered in a moth-eaten quilt. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, and a thin shaft of light pierced through a crack in the wall, painting a pale stripe across the room. Duke padded in first, nose low, tail stiff, his body language screaming caution. He sniffed at the corners, circled once, and finally sat by the hearth as if claiming it as his watchpost. Michael set down his duffel bag, ran a hand across the table, and came away with a layer of dust clinging to his calloused palm. "This is it," he whispered, almost to himself. Home. The word caught in his throat. Home was supposed to mean safety, warmth, belonging. To Michael, it was a word long abandoned on battlefields, buried under unpaid bills and long, sleepless nights. He sat heavily in the chair and stared at the wood stove. His thoughts drifted back to Iraq, to the nights when sandstorms howled against the barracks and men spoke quietly of what they would do when they made it home. Michael had pictured a house filled with laughter, children, maybe even grandchildren someday. But wars had a way of robbing futures as efficiently as they stole lives. His marriage had not survived the silences that came after his return. His daughter, now grown, rarely called. And so it was only him and Duke, sitting in a cabin at the edge of nowhere. Duke broke his reverie with a low growl. Michael's eyes flicked up, following the dog's gaze toward the window. Outside, the dam loomed like a sleeping giant, its concrete face streaked with black water stains. The structure towered above the cabin, a relic from the 1930s when men had believed concrete could tame rivers forever. But now its surface was cracked, weeds sprouting from the fissures, and water glistened in the thin trickles down its side. Michael rose and stepped outside. The late light of day caught the dam at an angle, emphasizing its wear. A shiver crawled down his spine. He knew enough about engineering to understand that dams, like men, carried scars, and scars always told a story. He crouched near the base where the ground was damp and pressed his palm to the soil. It came away wet. He frowned. "Not good," he muttered. Duke barked once, sharp and insistent, as if to agree. Inside, Michael lit a fire in the stove. The crackle of wood filled the silence, but it did little to ease the weight pressing on his chest. He thought of Tom again, of why his friend had chosen to leave him this place. Was it an act of kindness, or had Tom known the cabin carried a burden Michael had yet to understand? As the fire warmed the room, Michael stretched out on the bed. Duke curled at his feet, head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. Michael closed his eyes, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. He whispered, more to himself than to the dog, "Just one more night, and maybe tomorrow will feel different." But Duke did not sleep. His ears twitched at every creak, every sigh of the old cabin. His gaze kept returning to the dam as if he already sensed that beneath its crumbling face, a secret was waiting. One that would soon demand everything Michael had left to give. Rain fell hard against the cabin roof, drumming in uneven rhythms that seemed to echo inside Michael's chest. The fire he had built earlier hissed low, its embers struggling against the draft, sneaking through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the dam loomed in the darkness, hidden by fog, but alive in his imagination. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, boots still lacied, his body heavy with fatigue, yet his mind refusing to let go. Beside him, Duke lifted his head and growled softly. It was not the growl of aggression, but of warning, the kind he used back in the army kennels when something unfamiliar approached the perimeter. Michael frowned, listening. The rain masked almost everything, but beneath it he thought he heard a faint dripping, a sound distinct from the storm. Duke rose suddenly and padded to the door, claws clicking against the wooden floor. His tail was stiff, ears pricked, body a taut line of focus. Michael grabbed the flashlight from the table, shrugged into his jacket, and opened the door. Cold wind slapped his face, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and something metallic. He stepped outside, Duke bounding ahead but stopping short at the muddy ground near the base of the dam. Michael knelt, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the concrete wall. At first, he saw only water streaks, the kind he expected from an 80-year-old structure, but then the light caught a narrow fissure running vertically along one section, and from it seeped a thin but steady trickle of water. It was not wide, not catastrophic, but Michael knew enough to understand the language of cracks. He had seen walls breached in combat zones, barriers that looked strong crumble from one overlooked weakness. His throat tightened. A clap of thunder rolled overhead, startling him back to the present. He turned as headlights appeared in the distance along the dirt road. A small pickup truck approached, its tires splashing through the mud. Duke barked once, low and uncertain. The truck stopped near the cabin, and out stepped a woman holding a lantern against the rain. She was tall and lean, her shoulders wrapped in a faded green raincoat, hood pushed back to reveal auburn hair tied in a messy braid. Her face was angular, but softened by a pair of kind hazel eyes that crinkled when she spoke. "Evening," she called, voice steady despite the downpour. "You must be Michael Turner. I'm Sarah Collins. I live down the road." She extended a hand, and Michael shook it, surprised at the firm grip. Sarah was in her early 40s, a widow who had returned to her childhood home after her husband died in a logging accident 5 years prior. Life had carved a quiet resilience into her features. She carried herself like someone accustomed to work, strong, practical, with little patience for nonsense. She glanced toward the dam, her brow furrowing. "Duke's been raising a fuss, hasn't he?" "I could hear him all the way from my porch," Michael hesitated, then nodded toward the crack. "There's a leak," he said simply. Sarah stepped closer, lantern light catching the fissure. She crouched, her raincoat flaring behind her, and studied it with the calm eye of someone who had lived near the structure all her life. "It's been weeping like that for years," she said. "Town council says it's just surface runoff." Nothing to lose sleep over, Michael stiffened, memories of a rock flooding back unbidden. He saw again the night when a mud brick wall collapsed after days of hairline fractures, burying 2 men under rubble. He had promised their families they never felt pain, but he had seen the terror in their eyes as the wall gave way. His pulse quickened. "They're wrong," he muttered. "A crack is never just a crack. It grows." Sarah studied him for a moment, rain dripping from the brim of her hood. She saw not just the man, but the weight he carried, the haunted steel blue eyes that had witnessed too much. She didn't argue, only gave a slow nod. "Maybe you're right. I'll mention it again at the council meeting, though they don't like hearing bad news." Michael appreciated her restraint. He had grown tired of being dismissed as a paranoid veteran. "Thanks," he said quietly. Before she left, Sarah bent down to scratch Duke behind the ears. The shepherd accepted it reluctantly, still tense, his eyes fixed on the dam. "Smart dog," Sarah said with a faint smile. "Sometimes animals sense what we can't." She straightened, lantern glowing against the fog. "If you need anything, my place is the white farmhouse 2 bends down. You'll know it by the wind chimes." Then she climbed back into her truck and drove off, leaving Michael alone again, with the rain in his thoughts. Back inside, he removed his wet jacket and sank heavily into the chair by the fire. Duke circled once before lying at his feet, head resting on his paws but eyes unblinking. Michael stared into the flames, his mind caught between past and present. He remembered sandbags stacked against riverbanks overseas, the smell of diesel and sweat as soldiers scrambled to hold the line. He remembered men who trusted him to see danger before it struck. And now, here he was, in a forgotten Kentucky town, staring at a crack in a dam that no one cared about. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the flask in his duffel. He unscrewed it, took a long pull, and felt the burn of cheap whiskey steady him. He hated the weakness, but the silence was worse. Hours passed, the storm easing to a drizzle. Yet the sound of dripping outside did not stop. Michael knew he would not sleep. He rose once more, Duke following, and walked back to the dam. The flashlight beam cut across the concrete, revealing the trickle still glistening in the weak light. He pressed his palm against it, cold water seeping into his skin, and whispered, "This is how it starts." Duke whined softly, leaning against his leg. Michael looked up at the towering face of the dam, water pressing from the other side like a silent army. He felt the old dread coiling in his stomach, the knowledge that one overlooked weakness could bring everything down. The cabin behind him was no sanctuary, the town downriver no refuge. If the dam broke, it would all vanish in an instant. He drew a long breath, squared his shoulders, and turned back toward the cabin. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find someone who would listen, but tonight he carried the weight alone, with Duke as his only witness. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the air thick with the smell of damp earth and wet pine. Mist clung low across the valley as Michael guided Duke into town. He wore his only decent jacket, army green and frayed at the cuffs, boots still muddy from the night before. His steel blue eyes held a grim focus. He had promised himself during the long hours of sleeplessness that he would not keep silent. The crack in the dam was not just weathering, it was a warning, and he would make people listen. Duke padded beside him, ears twitching at every sound, tail low but steady. The German shepherd looked less like a pet and more like a soldier on patrol, his gait synchronized with Michael's in silent discipline. The town of Willow Ridge was small, its main street lined with clapboard buildings faded by decades of sun and rain. A diner with fogged-up windows released the smell of bacon and coffee into the cool morning. The gas station had one pump still in service, its sign squealing in the wind. Across from it stood the municipal building, a squat brick structure with peeling paint around its white-framed windows. Michael headed there first. Inside, the reception desk was manned by Clara Jenkins, a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair, round spectacles, and a sharp tongue sharpened by years of dealing with small-town complaints. Her hands were veined but nimble as she tapped away at an old computer. She looked up, adjusting her glasses, and pursed her lips at the sight of Duke. "Dogs aren't usually allowed inside, Mr. Turner?" "Michael Turner," he said, voice clipped. "This is Duke." "He stays," Clara sniffed but said nothing, perhaps reading the tension in his stance. Michael leaned against the counter, knuckles white. "I need to speak to the council, or the sheriff." "The dam is leaking." Her eyebrows rose. "That dam has leaked since I was a girl. You're new here, aren't you?" People talk. Michael's jaw clenched. "This isn't gossip. It's real. You'll lose this whole town if nothing is done." Before Clara could retort, the door opened and Sheriff Bradley walked in. He was a man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with a belly that hinted at too many late-night meals. His dark hair was graying at the temples, trimmed neatly above ears that stuck out slightly. A thick mustache covered his upper lip, and his eyes, brown, heavy-lidded, spoke of a man weary from years of listening to complaints, many exaggerated, some tragic. He carried himself with the deliberate calm of a lawman who preferred to diffuse tensions rather than escalate them. "Morning, Clara," he said before noticing Michael. "You must be the vet who moved into Tom Miller's old place. Bradley, sheriff here." He extended a hand. Michael shook it, grip firm. "There's a problem at the dam." Bradley sighed, glancing toward Duke as though the dog's intensity made him uneasy. "We hear that a lot. Folks like to blame the dam for everything, low water tables, bad crops, noisy nights. But it's been standing near a century." Tough old thing. Michael felt anger surge, but he forced his voice low. "I've seen structures fail. Rock, concrete, walls, barricades. Doesn't matter how long they've stood. All it takes is one crack." Bradley studied him for a moment, picking up the weight behind those words. But then he gave a slow shake of his head. "I respect your service, Turner, but panic can hurt more than a crack. The council will want evidence before they raise a fuss. Bring them something more than a hunch." Michael's shoulders sagged. He turned, leaving the office with Duke close at his heel. Outside, laughter drifted from the diner. A group of locals sat at a corner table, mugs of coffee in hand. Among them was Earl Thompson, a wiry man in his 60s with a sun-creased face and a perpetual smirk. His plaid shirt was unbuttoned at the top, showing a patch of chest hair. Earl had spent his life logging and now spent his mornings gossiping. "Hey, soldier boy," Earl called out when Michael passed. "See any ghosts in that dam last night?" The men at the table chuckled. Michael stopped, every muscle tense. His instinct was to confront, to snap back, but the weight of too many battles held him still. He caught sight of Duke, the shepherd sitting loyally by his leg, amber eyes fixed on him, as if reminding him who he was now. Michael breathed deep, then walked on. Inside his chest, however, burned the same sense of alienation he had felt since returning from war. The looks, the whispers, paranoid vet, unstable soldier. It was easier for people to dismiss him than to believe in danger. Later that afternoon, he found himself outside Sarah Collins' farmhouse, the white paint peeling but clean, wind chimes tinkling from the porch as she had said. She opened the door with sleeves rolled to her elbows, auburn braids swinging. "You look like you didn't win many friends in town," she remarked. Michael gave a bitter smile. "They don't believe me?" Sarah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "That's Willow Ridge for you. Folks trust what they see, not what they're told. but sometimes they need someone stubborn enough to keep shouting until it matters. Michael looked down at Duke, who pressed against his leg. For the first time that day, a flicker of warmth stirred in his chest. Sarah's words did not erase the doubt gnawing at him, but they steadied his resolve. That evening, back at the cabin, the mist had thickened again, wrapping the dam in ghostly veils. Michael sat on the porch, Duke's head resting against his knee. The dog's steady presence kept him from sinking completely into the despair of being dismissed. Alone, yes, but not entirely. Michael whispered into the fog, "I won't let them laugh this off. Not again." Not this time. Duke's ears flicked, and his tail thumped once, as if in agreement. The day after his failed attempt to warn the town, Michael could not shake the sound of their laughter. It clung to him, scraping against the scars in his mind like grit under bandages. The morning fog lifted slowly over the dam, revealing its cracked surface in full daylight. He stared at it with clenched fists before deciding he needed proof, something tangible that could not be dismissed as paranoia. Duke followed, ears sharp, tail low, as Michael circled around the base of the structure toward a rusted metal door, half buried by vines and fallen branches. It was the entrance to the old turbine house, where the dam's machinery had once roared with power. Now the door sagged on its hinges, paint long gone, iron corroded with decades of neglect. Michael tugged, and the hinges screamed in protest before giving way. Inside was darkness laced with the smell of mildew, rust, and stagnant water. His flashlight beam swept across shattered gauges, broken pipes, and heaps of debris. Duke's claws clicked against the damp concrete floor as he sniffed cautiously, tail stiff. Michael's boots splashed in shallow puddles as he moved deeper. Memories of Iraq returned, sweeping abandoned compounds, never knowing if a hidden danger waited in the shadows. His breath tightened, but he pressed on, muttering, "Just keep moving." Duke looked back once, amber eyes steady, and Michael felt anchored again. In a far corner beneath a collapsed shelf, something caught the light. A metal lockbox, dented and covered in grime, half buried under rotted canvas. Michael knelt, pried it loose, and forced it open with his knife. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin, surprisingly intact. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped them and found a thick leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. The journal smelled of old ink and dust, the paper yellowed and brittle. On the inside cover, written in firm script, were the words, "Property of engineer Thomas Whitaker, 1932. Michael frowned. He had never heard the name. He flipped to the first entry, dated March 1932, and began to read. Whitaker described the construction of the dam, the rushed deadlines, the political pressure, the corners cut to save money. "The steel delivered is substandard," one entry read. "I raised my objections, but the company insisted the public need outweighed perfection. I fear this structure will not endure as long as they claim. Perhaps a few decades, no more." Michael's hand shook as he turned the pages. Each entry laid bare the truth. This dam had been built on compromise and deception, destined to fail. Later entries grew darker. Hairline cracks already appearing. Supervisors dismissed them as cosmetic. "I fear one day this wall will betray us all." His breath caught. He pressed his palm against the damp page as if to steady the words. His chest tightened with anger, not at the dam itself, but at the arrogance of those who had gambled with lives for profit. He thought of the families downriver, unaware they lived beneath a ticking clock. He thought of the men he had lost overseas because someone in an office had made a calculated risk. Duke whined softly and pushed his nose against Michael's arm. The shepherd's fur was damp, his warm breath grounding. Michael let out a shaky laugh. "You always know when to pull me back, don't you?" Duke wagged his tail once, solemn, then sat close as if to shoulder part of the burden. Michael packed the journal and papers into his bag, knowing this was the evidence he needed. As he turned, a shadow startled him, a figure standing in the doorway. He tensed, hand reaching instinctively toward his belt where a weapon used to hang, though now there was only the empty habit of an old soldier. It was Henry Lawson, the town's maintenance man. Henry was in his mid-60s, short and stocky, with a thick white beard that spilled over his collar. His clothes smelled of machine oil, and his hands were permanently stained with grease. His eyes, however, were surprisingly gentle, though narrowed now in suspicion. "Didn't expect anyone poking around in here," Henry said, voice gravelly but not unkind. Michael straightened, wary. "Door wasn't locked." Henry chuckled dryly. "Hasn't been in 20 years. Ain't much left worth locking." His gaze dropped to the bag on Michael's shoulder. "Found something, didn't you?" Michael hesitated before pulling out the journal. Henry stepped closer, wiping his hands on a rag, and peered at the cracked leather, his brows knit. "Whitaker. My daddy used to mention that name. Said the engineer quit before the dam was finished, claimed it was cursed. Folks laughed him off." Michael opened to a page and held the light steady so Henry could read. The old man's lips moved silently over the words, his face tightening. At last he sighed. "Guess the fool was right, but try telling that to the council. They'll say you dug up bedtime stories." Frustration burned in Michael's gut. "People could die if we wait." Henry met his eyes, the weight of experience in his own. "Son, I've been fixing pipes, roads, and fences my whole life. This town doesn't believe nothing until it breaks under them. Best you brace yourself." The words carried no malice, only resignation. Michael hated it, but he recognized truth. He had seen the same indifference in command back in Iraq, warnings ignored until blood was spilled. He clenched his fists, then loosened them slowly. Henry patted Duke's head. The dog tolerated it, ears still perked. "Fine animal," Henry said softly. "Stands by you even when the world won't. Don't waste that." He tipped his hat and shuffled out into the daylight. Michael lingered a moment longer, then closed the door behind him. The journal felt heavier than its weight as he slung the bag over his shoulder. Proof lay in his hands, but proof alone might not be enough. He looked up at the dam, towering above him like a relic of arrogance, and felt the burden settle deep in his chest. As he walked back toward the cabin, Duke pacing loyally at his side, Michael whispered, "We're not crazy. We're right, and they'll see it, one way or another." The day had been strangely warm for late autumn, the kind of warmth that carried unease instead of comfort. By dusk, heavy clouds rolled in, thick and black, swallowing the last of the sunlight. Michael stood on the cabin porch with Duke at his side, both staring at the dam that loomed in the distance. A hush fell over the valley, broken only by the restless tinkling of Sarah's wind chime somewhere down the road. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth, a sure sign that a storm was brewing. By nightfall, rain began to fall, soft at first, then in sheets that hammered against the roof like artillery fire. Michael felt his chest tighten with each flash of lightning, illuminating the cracks in the dam. He thought of Whitaker's journal, tucked safely inside his duffel, the warnings etched in ink nearly a century ago. He had proof, but proof would mean little if the dam gave way before anyone listened. Duke paced the floorboards restlessly, ears pricked at every distant groan of the structure. Then came the sound that froze Michael's blood. A deep, hollow crack reverberating from the direction of the dam, muffled beneath the roar of the storm. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of a barrier under strain. Michael pulled on his jacket, grabbed the coil of rope and a few canvas sandbags he had salvaged earlier, and strode into the rain. Duke followed instantly, water streaming off his sable coat. The ground was already turning to mud, sucking at Michael's boots as he dragged the supplies closer to the dam's base. His flashlight cut through sheets of water, revealing rivulets pouring down the dam face like veins of silver. One fissure in particular had widened, the stream spilling fast and violent. Lightning revealed another figure struggling toward him from the road. It was Daniel Ross, a farmer from the next valley. Daniel was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of lifting hay bales and working soil. He had a rough-hewn look with a square jaw covered in stubble, sun-browned skin, and tired hazel eyes. Life had not been kind. His crops had failed 2 seasons in a row, and rumor said his wife had left with their 2 children. Daniel carried a lantern, its light flickering wildly in the wind, and shouted over the storm, "You're out here too?" Michael tightened the rope around a sandbag, shouting back, "If this gives, your farm goes first." Daniel cursed under his breath, but dropped to his knees to help, his large hands surprisingly deft as they tied the knots. "Town council won't lift a finger. Always said the dam would outlast us. Guess tonight we find out They worked side by side in the storm, stacking sandbags against the worst of the leak. The rain lashed at their faces, thunder splitting the sky. Twice Michael nearly lost his footing as the mud slid beneath him. Duke barked sharply each time, circling close, as though reminding him not to falter. Then it happened. Michael slipped on the slick concrete edge, the rope whipping from his grasp as he tumbled toward the rushing water below. The current surged black and merciless, ready to swallow him whole. He reached instinctively, fingers grasping at nothing. Duke lunged, teeth clamping down on the end of the rope that trailed from Michael's waist. The shepherd dug his paws into the mud, muscles straining, growling low as he held on. Michael dangled for a moment that felt eternal, rain and river spray blinding him, until Daniel grabbed his arm with a grunt and hauled him back onto solid ground. Michael lay on the mud, chest heaving, soaked through, staring up at the dark sky fractured by lightning. Duke dropped the rope and pressed his wet muzzle against Michael's cheek, whining. Michael's voice cracked as he whispered, "Good boy. You saved me." Daniel sat back on his heels, panting, his face lit briefly by another flash of lightning. "Damn, Turner," he said hoarsely. "You weren't exaggerating. This thing's ready to burst." They secured the last of the sandbags, though both men knew it was little more than a desperate patch on a failing wall. The rain did not relent, and the cracks continued to groan under the pressure of the swollen reservoir. Still, Michael felt a grim determination settle over him. He would not stand idle. Not tonight. When dawn finally threatened, the storm had not fully broken, but had spent enough fury to leave them exhausted. Michael leaned against the wall of the cabin, Duke pressed against his leg, Daniel slumped nearby. The dam still stood, scarred but unbroken. For now. Michael looked at Duke's amber eyes, steady and loyal, and felt a flicker of faith that they could hold the line until others believed. The storm had wrung Michael dry. His arms ached from hauling sandbags. His legs trembled from fighting the mud that clung to him like chains, and his lungs burned with every breath of icy rain. Dawn was still hours away. The valley locked in a chaos of thunder and water. The dam groaned under the weight of the swollen reservoir, a living beast straining against its cage. Michael, caked in mud and soaked to the bone, dropped to his knees at the base of the structure. His hands dug into the wet earth, as if anchoring himself to it. "Lord," he rasped, his voice nearly drowned by the storm, "I can't do this alone. I don't have the strength. But these people, they've got children, families. Don't let them be buried. Give me something, just enough to keep this wall standing." His words were raw, torn straight from his chest. Duke pressed close, his sable fur plastered against Michael's side, barking into the storm as if to add his own voice to the plea. The sound carried farther than Michael realized. Not just a bark, but a warning, sharp and insistent, slicing through the thunder. Lights flickered in distant windows of farmhouses, lanterns and flashlights bobbing in the rain. And then, like figures emerging from fog, neighbors began to appear. The first was Jacob Miller, a wiry man in his late 30s with straw blonde hair plastered to his forehead. His face was narrow, his skin weathered from long days in the fields. Jacob was a quiet man, known more for the work of his hands than his words, but tonight his jaw was set with determination. He carried a pitchfork over one shoulder and a stack of empty feed sacks under the other. "Heard the dog!" Jacob shouted over the wind. Figured something was wrong. Behind him came Ruth Delgado, a stout woman in her 50s with dark curls flattened by the rain, her brown skin glistening under the lantern she carried. Ruth was the owner of the town's small grocery, known for her blunt tongue and stubborn heart. She had once worked in construction in her youth, and her strong hands had never lost their grip. "If the dam goes, the store goes with it," she barked. "I won't watch my livelihood drown." She dropped a bundle of shovels into the mud and rolled up her sleeves. One by one, more figures joined. Daniel Ross returned with a wagon of sand from his farm, his eyes still shadowed by weariness, but burning now with purpose. Sarah Collins arrived in her green raincoat, her braids soaked through, leading 2 teenage boys from her farm, her nephews, lanky and uncertain, but eager to prove themselves. Sheriff Bradley appeared last, soaked hat pulled low, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, his weary brown eyes sharper than Michael had seen before. Bradley knelt beside Michael, his mustache dripping rain. "Guess you weren't imagining things," he admitted. "The crack's wider. We'll need every hand." Michael met his eyes, exhaustion and relief mingling. "I told you." The sheriff nodded once, then turned to the others. "All right, folks. No time for debate. We pile sand here, here, and here. Daniel, bring your wagon closer. Ruth, you and Sarah handle filling sacks. Jacob, you're with me on the wall. Let's move." For the next hour, the valley became a battleground. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, their lanterns glowing like stars in the storm. Shovels bit into wet earth, sacks filled and lifted, ropes tied and tightened. The dam shuddered, but for every groan of concrete, a dozen voices shouted against it, refusing to yield. Michael, though drained, found a new strength among them. He heaved sacks alongside Jacob, his muscles screaming, but his heart steady. Duke darted along the line, barking whenever a sack slipped or a rope loosened, his presence keeping them alert. Sarah's nephews, their faces pale, nearly dropped from exhaustion, but Sarah's sharp encouragement kept them on their feet. Ruth cursed at the storm, as if sheer defiance could keep it at bay. At one point, a loose sack tore open, spilling sand into the rushing water. Ruth knelt instantly to patch it, her hands raw and bleeding, but she didn't stop. "I didn't raise 3 sons just to let a wall beat me," she growled. Bradley hauled another rope taut, his face red with strain, but he refused to let go. Michael's prayer lingered in his mind, steadying him. He realized the answer had not come in thunder or miracle. It had come in the form of these neighbors, these people who had doubted him, now standing in the rain beside him. For the first time since Iraq, he felt he was not fighting alone. Hours blurred together until the storm finally weakened. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, and the thunder retreated beyond the hills. The dam still leaked, the cracks still scarred, but it stood, and so did they. Michael leaned against the wall of sandbags, every muscle quivering, his chest heaving with fatigue. Duke pressed against him, tail giving a single tired wag. Around them, lanterns flickered as neighbors collapsed onto the mud, laughing breathlessly, cheering weakly, some even crying. They were soaked, dirty, and spent, but alive, and together. Michael whispered, voice hoarse but certain, "Thank you, Lord." He pressed his hand into Duke's wet fur, the dog's steady warmth grounding him. The storm had quieted into a steady drizzle, but the valley remained heavy with tension. The dam groaned under the relentless pressure, each sound like a warning. Michael, Sarah, Daniel, Ruth, Jacob, and the few others who had gathered were muddy, drenched, and nearly spent. Yet the work continued, sandbags stacked, ropes tightened, hands raw but unyielding. Lanterns flickered faintly, their glow almost lost in the rain. Then, from the road above, new lights appeared, bright beams slicing through the fog and mist. Headlamps, flashlights, and the glow of more lanterns. The sound of engines echoed, followed by the crunch of boots in the mud. Sheriff Bradley lifted his head, relief crossing his weary face. "Looks like reinforcements," he muttered. The figures drew closer, and Michael felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt in years: hope. The first to step into the glow was Ethan Walker, a young engineer barely in his 30s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones, sandy brown hair matted by the rain, and thin wire-rimmed glasses fogged by his breath. Ethan carried himself with a quiet urgency. He had returned to Willow Ridge only 6 months earlier after studying civil engineering in Charleston. Many in town had dismissed him as the bookish boy with theories, but tonight his eyes burned with conviction. "Sheriff," he called, holding a waterproof case close to his chest. "I've got maps of the dam, original schematics. My grandfather helped survey this place. We can reinforce it smarter, not just harder." His voice, though youthful, carried authority born from knowledge. Behind him came townsfolk of all kinds. Marvin Gray, the blacksmith in his late 50s with arms like iron and a soot-stained beard, hauled coils of chain and tools. Ella Price, a schoolteacher in her early 40s with pale skin, auburn hair tucked under a soaked bonnet, guided 2 of her older students carrying sacks. Even Pastor Whitmore, a thin, gray-haired man in his 70s with sunken cheeks but a steady gaze, had come with a lantern and a prayer book in his pocket. One by one, their faces emerged from the storm, faces Michael had seen in the diner, the grocery, walking down Main Street. Faces that once dismissed him, now walked toward the danger he had named. Sheriff Bradley clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "We could use your brains, son. Tell us where to put the weight." Ethan knelt by the wall, unrolling a plastic-covered map, his hands trembling but precise. "The west side spillway is weakest. We need to stack sandbags there, reinforce the joints with chain, and divert flow with trenches along the slope. If we can redirect some of the overflow, the dam has a chance." Michael bent low to study the plan, impressed. "You're right. This makes sense." Ethan gave him a quick look, eyes flashing with gratitude. "You saw it first. Without you, we'd be too late." The work began in earnest. Dozens of people moved in rhythm, filling, lifting, and stacking. Bradley barked instructions with the voice of command, his mustache bristling as he paced the line. Ruth Delgado directed a group of younger volunteers like a sergeant, shouting corrections when a bag slipped. Daniel Ross, still mud-smeared and exhausted, hauled sack after sack, his broad shoulders refusing to quit. Sarah's nephews dug trenches with Jacob Miller, their faces pale but determined. And through it all, Duke became their silent sentinel. The shepherd darted up and down the line, barking when a lantern flickered too close to collapsing, growling low when he heard the ominous cracks deep inside the dam, even nudging tired hands back into motion. His amber eyes gleamed in the stormlight, his black and tan coat slicked against his ribs. To many of the townsfolk, he looked less like a dog and more like an angel in fur, leading them in the darkest night. At one point, Ella Price stumbled, nearly sliding into the rushing water, but Duke lunged, blocking her fall until two men grabbed her arms. "Good Lord," she gasped, clutching the dog's neck. "He saved me." Pastor Whitmore, kneeling in the mud with a spade in hand, whispered words of prayer that blended with the sound of shovels and water. "Strengthen these hands, O Lord. Hold these walls." His voice wove through the night, steadying those around him. Michael found himself shoulder to shoulder with men and women who, hours earlier, would not have given him more than a passing glance. Their faces were lined with determination, not doubt. He felt the ache of every scar in his body, but also the warmth of something long forgotten. Belonging. By midnight, the reinforcement began to take shape. The west side, once on the verge of collapse, now stood braced with sand, chain, and sweat. The trenches diverted rivulets into controlled streams, reducing the strain on the wall. The dam still groaned, but it no longer screamed. Finally, when the rain eased into mist and the wind fell silent, the valley lay in eerie calm. The dam remained standing, scarred but holding. A ragged cheer erupted, tired but triumphant, echoing through the darkness. People clapped each other's backs, some wept openly, lanterns lifted high as symbols of victory. Michael leaned heavily against the wall of sandbags. Duke pressed close. For the first time, when he met the eyes of the townsfolk, he saw no mockery, no dismissal, only respect, gratitude, and shared relief. Sarah stepped near, her auburn braids soaked and loose, placing a hand on his arm. "You did it, Michael. You were right. And you weren't alone." He nodded, throat tight. He looked at Duke, who thumped his tail once, as though he had known all along. That night, the people of Willow Ridge did not go home defeated. They went home with a new memory etched into their lives. The night they stood together beneath the storm, guided by the bark of a loyal dog and the stubborn courage of a soldier who refused to give up. 6 months passed, and winter gave way to spring in the valley of Willow Ridge. The dam, once a scar of fear, now stood reinforced with steel plates, fresh concrete, and carefully monitored spillways, all secured by federal funds that came after Ethan Walker presented his schematics. And the townsfolk testified about the night of the storm, where once there had been groaning cracks and leaking fissures, there was now stability, still weathered, still old, but cared for at last. Michael Turner often found himself pausing by its base, Duke sitting proudly beside him, both silent witnesses to the fight that had turned strangers into allies. Life had changed for Michael. The cabin, once nothing more than a gift of pity, had become home. He patched the roof, replaced the broken shutters, and built a modest porch overlooking the lake. A battered wooden sign now hung by the roadside. Turner's Repairs, engines, tools, small machinery. The shop, no bigger than a shed, smelled of oil, wood shavings, and hard work. Farmers brought him broken tractors, mothers brought him squeaky washing machines, and kids came with bent bicycles. Michael's hands, scarred and calloused, found new purpose. The man who had once been dismissed as a paranoid veteran now became the one people trusted when something vital broke. Duke became a legend of his own. The children of Willow Ridge adored him, flocking to the shop after school. They laughed when he bounded through puddles, tails wagging like a banner, and they named him the Watchman of the Dam. The dog seemed to understand, patrolling the lake shore with calm authority, as if he knew the weight of the title. Michael often smiled when he heard their shouts of, "There goes our hero!" He would shake his head, but his eyes always softened. Sarah Collins remained a steady presence in his life. She often stopped by with baskets of vegetables or a fresh loaf of bread, her auburn hair tied back, cheeks glowing from farm work. Her nephews, taller now from months of growth, sometimes helped Michael stack firewood or repair tools. Their laughter filled the once silent cabin, and though Sarah never said it aloud, Michael felt in her company a quiet companionship that steadied his heart. Ethan Walker, the young engineer, became something of a local figure. His once dismissed theories now earned him respect, and he worked with federal contractors during the repairs. He often visited Michael to talk through plans or share a beer on the porch. His wire-rimmed glasses still fogged whenever he grew animated, but behind them gleamed the same fire that had saved the town. On Sundays, Pastor Whitmore spoke often of that night, his voice trembling with both humility and pride. When one man knelt in the mud and prayed, the Lord answered, not with angels, but with neighbors. The congregation would murmur, "Amen," and many turned their eyes toward Michael, who always lowered his head, uncomfortable with praise. Sheriff. Bradley, too, had changed. Once weary and doubtful, he now greeted Michael with a firm handshake whenever they crossed paths. "You kept us alive that night," he admitted one afternoon at the diner, his mustache twitching, "and I'll never forget it." Michael's own changes were quieter, hidden in his chest. The laughter of the townsfolk no longer cut him down. The sound now warmed him. The nightmares of Iraq still came, but less often, and when they did, Duke's steady presence chased them away. He found himself breathing easier, shoulders less burdened, when he heard the rustle of children running by or the wind chimes at Sarah's porch. One evening, after a long day repairing a farmer's plow, Michael sat on the porch with Duke stretched at his feet. The Appalachian ridges glowed gold and violet under the setting sun, clouds lit like brushstrokes of fire. He leaned against the porch post, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Duke raised his head, amber eyes watching him, before settling back with a sigh. Michael spoke softly, his voice carried on the still air. "Finally, I'm home." The words were not just for himself, but for the men he had lost, the town that had once doubted him, and the loyal dog who had never left his side. The dam stood tall in the distance, no longer a symbol of fear, but of resilience. And in its shadow, Michael Turner, soldier, worker, neighbor, found peace at last. The story of Michael Turner and his loyal dog Duke is not only about saving a dam, but about saving a community from silence, disbelief, and fear. A broken veteran found healing not in solitude, but in the hands of neighbors who stood together in the storm. The night the town listened, when the sheriff, the farmer, the teacher, and even the children fought side by side, was the night Willow Ridge learned that resilience is born from unity. The dam may have been repaired with steel and concrete, but what truly held it was faith, courage, and the bond between one soldier, his K-9, and the people who chose to believe. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They come through the bark of a loyal dog, the clasp of a neighbor's hand, or the quiet courage to stand together in the rain. Just as God gave Michael strength in his weakest moment, he offers us the same in our daily struggles, whether in family, work, or the hidden battles of the heart. If this story touched you, take a moment to pray for strength. Share this message, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so together we can spread more stories of hope. May the Lord bless you and your family with peace, faith, and endless love.